Okay, we are once again back at the Ghost. So, new rims. These are brand new from Apollo. I've had them for a week or so. It's the old rims. So actually, these are different. So the 2022 Ghost is different than my Ghost in that one of the things they did was they beefed up the rims. And I didn't think that would apply to my old Ghost, being as it's an old one, but apparently it's just a different design. So here's the busted one. You can see there's a chunk there, and then here's the split here. So if you look at these side by side, you notice the rings the bolts go into are actually thicker. So they've addressed that problem, or they're at least attempting to. You can also notice if you look at the width of the rim on the edge, notice how the new one is different. It's taller there. Also notice how this one is very thin through this section as well. I don't know how the camera's catching this, but you'll notice that this one, it's wider on this dimension, and then it, instead of just immediately going that way, it actually has like a little bit of a bevel. So it's thicker in every dimension. And then this part right here on the inside is actually closer to being a flat than this one, which is more curved. So it's just thicker in every dimension, like significantly thicker. The internal profile looks exactly the same. And then the inside back here at the thickest part of the inside is the same. So what they've done is they've just beefed up the rim in every other dimension that they possibly can. So I still am thinking I'm just going to sell this, but I don't know. The fact that they went back and beefed these up, it kind of gives me a little confidence. Like maybe I won't sell it. Maybe I'll keep it for a while. I don't know. I did put the factory front caliper back on because I've been intending on selling this thing after I get it back together. So what I've done here, and I'll start from the beginning, what I've done here is the tube actually has some air in it. So you notice it's not just flat. And the reason for that is when it's completely deflated, it's really tough to get the split rims together without pinching the tube. But if you notice, I'm just going to set this right in there like that, and I'm going to flip it around. That tube, because I inflated it a little bit, look at that tube is nowhere near the rim. So I can safely assemble this wheel without fear of pinching the tube. So that's a pretty big deal. And so that's one of those things I tell you, I don't have a pound. You know, if you're one of those people that has to measure everything, that's a tedious way to be a mechanic. And no real mechanic does that. I mean, some measure more than others, but you know, like nobody's whipping out their torque wrench to bolt in a bucket seat. Like realistically, nobody's doing that, right? So same thing here. I don't know how many pounds I put in the tube. You just put a little bit of air in it, man. Just a little bit of air, and you're good to go. You don't want too much. You don't want so much, because what's going to happen is the more air you put in, the more the tube is going to expand. And if you expand the tube too much, then you can't get the wheels together without pinching it. Well, then you know you've gone too far. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably a pound or less of air. Probably less, but just a teensy weensy bit. And then you can feed your valve stem into the valve stem hole, which is right, well, angle of the camera is going to be tough to show, but you'll just have to believe me, I guess. And then you line up the divots in the motor with the rings for the wheel bolts, and it's a tighter fit with this new rim design. It's a much tighter fit, which I think is a good thing. Now I have to find all my bolts. So I did not prepare for this at all. So this is where we're just going to be going right off of where I left off with no preparation. So excuse me for that. I'll get my handy dandy tool sets ready to go here. Like my Milwaukee ratchets, and I believe that's a 4mm correct 4mm. So what I'll do with these is I will go around the wheel and I'll just get it started, making sure that it's threading in. That one's going in a little tight. Sometimes if they go in a little tight, I'll go back and check. They're all kind of going in a little tight, so those two at least. It's probably because the wheel or the rim is a little bit cocked, so it's probably rubbing on the shank. Yeah, it's just rubbing on the shank. So I just get them in there a few threads. You want to do more than like 1 or 2 just because it's aluminum, and you could just reach in, grab the bolt, and rip 2 threads out of it. So I like to get a few threads in there. And then what I'll do by hand with this little socket here, you can use a regular Allen wrench for this whole process if that's what you want to do. You don't have to do it my way. There's always more than one way to do it. But I'll go back and see, that one's really having a rough time going in. So I'll kind of push down on the rim a little, and there it goes. Yeah. Yeah, so this is just a tighter fit all around. It actually looks like the head of these bolts. Normally I use my power ratchet, but at this point, this rim is fitting real tight. So I'm gonna use a hand ratchet. Now my power ratchet also works as a hand ratchet. I don't have to hit the gas, but so this is there, that's tight. You don't want to get these too tight. So I'll get that one there. So those are all the way in now. So I'm going to try one with this. Okay. Let's go over here. I'm not doing the final tighten. Okay. Okay. Thought I heard a little pop in there, so I'm wondering if it's catching on the tube. One of the things you can do, it's real tough with these PMT tires because they have real stiff sidewalls, but it's a lot easier with the factory tires, is you can actually push the beads in and you can look where the rims meet. It's tough to show on camera, but you can make sure that there's nothing actually caught in between the rims. So if you want to make sure that the tube is free the whole way around, it's a good way to go. So yeah, so you got to be careful using power tools, especially if you're installing a redesigned part that you're not familiar with, that you have no experience with. So, all right, this time I'm going to go around and, okay, that's good. Click. Notice how I'm going in a star pattern. So I went from the top bolt, now I'm going to the bottom bolt. That's pretty tight. I'm going to go back to the top bolt. Okay, that's good enough for me. So tight, tight. Now I'm going over here. That one's tight. I'm gonna go over here. That one's tight. Now I'm gonna go over to this guy. Oh yeah, that's tight. And then I'm gonna go over to this one. Yeah, tight. Okay, so we're good there. All right, now we're gonna put the brake rotor back on. I gotta remember which orientation this is supposed to go in. So it's gonna go like that. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. Is if you've got one on and one off, they're both gonna be pointed in the same direction. Another thing you can do is if you look at this one, maybe you can see these have little rings around them. Nice little rings pressed in. On this side, you can see that it's shiny and more of a flat pattern all the way across it. So obviously the one with the smaller shiny circles is the one where the heads of the bolts were fastened. So that's what you call a clue. It's always good to do one thing at a time on these, like just front or just rear if you can. Especially if you're not real familiar with doing this kind of work, if you're not like a mechanic or a bike mechanic, or somebody who just kind of has a natural talent for repair work. I do building maintenance. I was a mechanic for a long time. Went to trade school for that, deep sea diver. So maintenance is just what I do. I'm a professional maintenance guy. So I'd make plenty of mistakes myself, but there's just stuff that I can get away with that typical homeowner is not going to be able to, because I do it all the time. One way or another, I do it all the time. Okay, I'll do the same pattern here. So we're going to go real slow. Okay, I did not tighten that. I just let it bottom out real slow. Now, if you're not doing a final tightening, you don't need to do a star pattern. If you're just trying to get the slop out of everything, you can tighten it in any order you want. Now, one of the reasons I'm going back and doing a final tightening on the rim with this little ratchet here instead of this big mamma jamma right here is because even though this works just fine as a ratchet without power, it's long. That is, for a 1/4 inch ratchet, or for something that small, that is a lot of leverage, and it's very easy to over tighten stuff by hand. And it also reduces the amount of feel you have, because you can usually feel it when you're about to strip a fastener. So it's a good idea when you're doing something for the first time to give yourself as many advantages as possible. And this is all aluminum, this stuff, so it just does not need to be that tight. It's very easy to strip aluminum. So when in doubt, back off, back off. Obviously you don't want to make it, didn't quite seat that all the way. Obviously you don't want to make it too loose, because you can't have your rim come flying off while you're trying to. That's weird, the head on that one stripped. Yay. That's the one thing I'll tell you about. These are Nico sockets that I'm using right now. They're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're not the best. There's better ones. Obviously, like Snap-on and stuff. I wouldn't advocate anybody go out and buy that, but I'll show you what, if you're going to do this all by hand, or if you can only afford non-power tools, this is what you want. Vera, W-E-R-A. It's a German brand, and it's called Hex Plus. And if you notice, looking at these, they're not flat. It's like a little U shape in between, and they're actually pointed. What those points do is they dig into the corners of the fastener. And so they can, you can get a bolt head that looks stripped, and one of these will get in there and it'll work it no problem. Not guaranteed, not all the time, but often that will happen. So that's kind of a nice feature. Of the Hex Plus. So if you can only afford hand tools, these are the ones to get. Vera does also make sockets for Hex with that fancy Hex Plus feature. So notice these washers have flats, so it's an oval almost. It's not really a circle. So these axles actually have flat spots on them. If you can tell, it's a flat spot here, and this washer goes on that way. So you put on these washers, then you can slide slide the axle in. And as you do this, you have to line up the brake disc with the caliper, and you have to make sure you're lining the flats of the axle up properly. And then this cotter pin inside the brake caliper here is actually getting a little stabby. So cotter pins, if you can see that, you can see how I bent it in such a way as it's small leg going up, long leg going down. That's how I bend my cotter pins. One of the things I learned as a mechanic is that if you get a comeback, say somebody's been bringing their car into the same mechanic for 30 years, right? But that same mechanic might have, 4 or 5 other mechanics working for him. Well, if you get a comeback and say it was a ball joint and there's a cotter pin in the ball joint and there's something wrong with the suspension, I can look at the cotter pin, the way the cotter pin was bent, and have a good idea if I was the one who screwed it up or not. Some people bend them both legs towards the long side. Some of them bend both legs towards the short side. Some of them bend one leg down and snip the other leg. There's all different kinds of ways to bend a cotter pin. So I've kind of developed my own way of doing it, because if I ever screwed up, I wanted to make sure it was me that actually screwed up and that I'm not getting blamed for somebody else's mistake. Because Lord knows I make enough of my own mistakes to take it on the head for anyone else. But what's happening is this long leg here is kind of, because it was actually facing up, is kind of digging into the tire. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bend both legs on this down. So I'm going to grab a pair of pliers. Another good tidbit here is these are Knipex pliers. Knipex, I guess, is the proper way to say it. Again, they're German. Really nice pliers. Really, really nice pliers. You need good pliers, man. Channel locks are good. There's a lot of good brands of pliers, but these Knipex pliers are something else. Sometimes these things can be a real challenge. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just get a jaw on there. See if I can push it in. What this cotter pin does is it allows the brakes, the brake pads, to stay in position properly inside of the brake caliper. So I'll try it right there. See what that does. And I like to have an unpolished product as far as my YouTube videos, because look, I don't have any subscribers, nor do I really care if I ever get any. And I don't make any money. It's just something I'm doing to try and help people out. So, maybe you can watch this and get something from it. So yeah, now because that cotter pin is in the down orientation, it's looking good. And I have correctly reinstalled this front tire because there's an arrow on the sidewall. The arrow points forward. And you can actually look at the tread itself. And if you look at the tread itself, you can see the points on the tread are facing forward. So what that does is water will get in there, and these will channel the water away from the center of the tire, is the idea. So if you didn't know that already, now you do. So you can see this side pretty well, I'm hoping. So the way that this works is you have these particular washers, and you see they have these tongues, and these go on directly onto the axle. And they're the first washer you want to put on there, because inside of the frame of the front of the swing arm on the scooter, there's a notch, and that allows the axle to be properly located. Because what can happen is the axle could be crooked. It could be crooked this way. And then what happens is you're not tracking straight, so your alignment's off, and that's all screwed up, and that's a problem. Something else that can cause, because these notches aren't perfectly level this way, they're not perfectly horizontal, they're actually kind of like that. So if this thing's off a little bit, it actually makes the whole rotation completely screwed up. So you get a lot of problems from that. So the way around, a cheap way to solve that problem is to simply make a washer with a tongue, and you put that in there, and as you tighten it up, it will pull the axle into the proper orientation. So that goes on each side. So that's good. And then what we're going to do on this particular one is we have the front fender, and the front fender has flats on it, just like all these washers have flats. And we'll put the fender on over those little axle locating washers. Okay, there's one. This is kind of an annoying process. There it is. Sometimes you can smack it. Okay, then we got is our last washer. So then we're just going to put one more washer on top of that. And then we'll put on our axle nut. And that's one axle nut. So what I'll do is I'll get that one on by hand. And I'll make sure that inbound washer with the tongue on it is properly seated on this side. Now I'm going to do the other side, which you can't see. A trick I'll walk you through on this side. A trick I'll do when I'm installing a bolt or nut, if you've never done this before, is sometimes you can have a hard time getting the threads to catch, right? So what you can do is you actually turn it backwards. Okay, turn it like you're loosening it. You turn it backwards until you can get the threads to seat, and then you can spin it on there. You know, some nuts are trickier than other nuts, and boy, that phrase sure could be used a lot of different ways. I never said this was for kids. Okay, so these are both on by hand. I'm going to put my pliers away. Another fun Knipex German-made tool, pliers wrench. Of course, you could use a socket for this. You could use a regular wrench for this or an adjustable wrench for this. It doesn't matter to me. You do what you want to do, but I'm doing me right now, and I like these. So that one is pretty tight right there, nice and taut. As our friends across the pond might say. Oh, this is a charge port. I'll have to get to that eventually, especially if I'm going to sell it. Okay, so then this side. So I'm actually using these in the backwards orientation right now. Using this particular tool, really what you want to do is you want to apply pressure to this part of the handle here, the upper handle, because if you look at the way the jaw moves, what happens is if you apply pressure up here, what you're doing is you're actually making it clamp tighter to the fastener. So it makes it harder for it to strip or roll off or come off the nut or the bolt. If you're doing it the other way and you're putting pressure here, but you're squeezing it, what you're doing is you're kind of fighting yourself because you're doing it this way, and as you're torquing up here, it's trying to push that open. So sometimes because the way this head is this head is angled, you don't have a choice. Like, you just have to buck up and do it that way. But ideally, as often as possible, you'll tighten or loosen in this orientation so that you're applying the torque the proper way. Helping yourself out a little bit, you know? Lord knows there's enough fighting against you already. You really have to fight yourself too. Okay, that's it there. Now I just have to put some air in the tire and adjust the brake. So yeah, that's reinstalling a tire and tube. Not really much more to it than that. Adjusting the brakes is a separate thing. You know, if you do this and you don't do anything with the brake caliper, you won't have to worry about adjusting the brakes as much. I mean, you'll probably, anytime you remove the wheel, you're probably going to have to adjust the brakes, but You know, it'll be tiny little bits, you know, because I totally screwed around, put new different pads on there, a whole different caliper and everything like that. It's going to need a lot of screwing around with. So, yeah. But, and I'm not going to walk through that right now. I just don't have the mood for it. But anyway, I wanted to show you guys that updated rim design. I got to do the rear now. And it looked like it had a crack in it, but it doesn't. So yeah, so this one's going to come off the rear and this one's going to go on the rear. And it's definitely a beefier design. How much longer will it last? I don't know. I suspect they'll still fail in the same way, but probably not as soon or as critically. So improvement, sure, I'll take it. All right, man.